The Galactic Preservation Authority operated under a simple philosophy. If a planet couldn't follow the rules, the planet needed new management. Not new leadership, mind you. New management implied working with existing structures. The GPA preferred something more thorough, something involving the complete restoration of a world to factory settings, as if civilizations were smartphones that had accumulated too many questionable apps. Earth had failed 47 compliance checks in the past 3 standard cycles. 47. The record holder, a methane-soaked disaster in the Horsehead Nebula, had only managed 32 before the authority stepped in. Humanity wasn't just breaking rules. Humanity was speed-running catastrophic violations like it was an Olympic sport, and everyone wanted gold. The infractions ranged from adorable to apocalyptic. Atmospheric carbon levels that made the Benthosian observers wheeze through their respiratory sacs. Oceanic plastic deposits that the Aquaria trade representatives initially mistook for a new construction material. 7 different nuclear close calls that the Preservation Authority's monitoring satellites had caught, each one filed under unbelievable incompetence. See attached footage. And perhaps most damningly, humanity had somehow managed to invent and then militarize 17 different types of artificial intelligence before any of them became sentient enough to join the Galactic Union and vote on their own protection status. The paperwork alone occupied 3 entire data moons. A young woman sat in sub-level 47 of the GPA's Earth monitoring station, watching all of this unfold on screens that probably cost more than her home planet's GDP. She had no business being here. Her credentials were for custodial services on a mining outpost near Proxima Centauri. But 8 months ago, she'd accidentally boarded the wrong transport after a particularly enthusiastic night celebrating her 23rd birthday, and the universe had a sick sense of humor about these things. The Galactic Preservation Authority, in its infinite wisdom, had hired her anyway. In fairness to the GPA, they hadn't meant to. Their facial recognition systems were optimized for 17,000 different species across 800-member worlds. Humans, being relatively new to the galactic stage and remarkably similar looking to the bipedal Yenith from Sector 49, got processed through an algorithm that essentially shrugged and said close enough. She'd shown up, her stolen borrowed, she preferred borrowed credentials had pinged green, and suddenly she was a junior environmental assessment coordinator with full system access, and a salary that came with 3 currencies she couldn't pronounce. She'd been waiting for someone to notice the mistake for 33 days. Nobody had. The beings she worked alongside treated planetary annihilation with the enthusiasm of accountants filing quarterly reports. The Benthosians, gelatinous and perpetually damp, oozed through corridors while discussing extinction events like they were commenting on weather patterns. The Ferrite Collective, 8-foot-tall crystalline entities that communicated through light pulses, would strobe cheerfully about atmospheric purges during lunch breaks. And the Yenith, the species she'd been mistaken for, approached the entire concept of genocide with the energy of middle managers who'd found a particularly satisfying loophole in company policy. Today's briefing had been especially chipped. A Ferrite administrator named something that translated roughly to harmonious dissolution of problematic carbon chains had presented Earth's final assessment with strobing patterns that suggested deep satisfaction. The planet, harmonious dissolution explained through the translation node, had reached critical restoration threshold. All attempts at diplomatic correction had failed. Humanity's representatives at the Galactic Union kept insisting that problems were definitely being handled, while simultaneously setting new records for environmental disasters. The math was simple. The planet needed restoration. The God Key protocols would be activated within 6 standard rotations. Everyone had applauded. Well, the species with appendages capable of applause had applauded. The others had vibrated approvingly or emitted supportive chemical signature. She'd sat in the back, stunned into silence, watching her species receive a death sentence delivered with PowerPoint presentations and refreshments. The God Key. She'd heard whispers about it during her months of accidental employment. Ancient technology predating even the Galactic Union itself. A system so powerful that it could restore entire worlds to primordial states, wiping away millennia of development in hours. The Authority had used it exactly 7 times in recorded history, always as a last resort, always with the solemn weight of necessity. Except nobody here seemed particularly solemn. The Benthosian beside her had been checking messages during the presentation. Harmonious dissolution had cracked what passed for a joke among the ferret, something about carbon-based life forms and their attachment to existing, and half the room had strobed with laughter. After the briefing, she'd done what any rational person would do when discovering their planet had 6 days until apocalypse. She'd gone to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall designed for beings with 3 different types of waste elimination systems, and had a quiet, dignified panic attack. Then she'd started searching the network. The GPA's security was impressive when dealing with external threats. Against internal browsing from someone with legitimate credentials and nothing left to lose, laughably inadequate. She'd pulled up everything on God key protocols within 20 minutes. Authorization hierarchies, activation procedures, physical locations of the terminal interfaces. The system treated her queries like routine research, filing her searches under Junior Coordinator Professional Development. That's when she'd found it. A glorious, terrible, absolutely unintentional bureaucratic mistake. Her credentials generated by the malfunctioning facial recognition system and never properly audited, had been assigned security clearances based on her supposed Yenith identity. The Yenith who she'd been confused with, according to the personnel files she absolutely shouldn't have been able to access, had been a deceased senior administrator. Not just any administrator, the former director of terminal restoration procedures. Her borrowed identity had God key. She'd sat in that alien bathroom for another 30 minutes, mind racing through implications and possibilities. The terminal was on this station, 3 floors down behind security that her credentials would bypass like she was taking a casual stroll. The activation window opened in 6 days, but the systems would be live for testing and calibration starting tomorrow. Standard procedure, according to the files. Make sure the ancient apocalypse machine was properly warmed up before committing to planetary deletion. Walking away was an option. She could try to contact Earth, warn someone, though the communication channels were monitored and her credentials would be immediately flagged. She could attempt sabotage, though she had no idea how to break something that had successfully destroyed 7 worlds without breaking a sweat. She could run, desert her post, steal a ship, and hope the universe's comedic timing would carry her far enough away before anyone noticed. Or she could do something monumentally stupid. The shift change happened at 2. Most of the staff cleared out, heading to quarters or recreation facilities that catered to wildly different definitions of relaxation. She'd waited until 2:30, giving the corridors time to empty, then headed toward the restricted levels with nothing but confidence and a badge that said she belonged there. The elevator descended smoothly, past monitoring stations and data processing centers, past the cafeteria that served 40 different atmospheric compositions, past residential blocks, where beings dreamed in colors humans didn't have names for. Level 40. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked exactly like every other corridor, except for the subtle hum of power that suggested something massive drawing energy nearby. The God key terminal waited behind a door that opened with a cheerful chime when her badge touched the sensor. Inside, the room looked disappointingly mundane. Clean white surfaces, holographic displays floating at ergonomic heights for multiple species, a central console that resembled a reception desk more than a weapon of planetary destruction, the universe's most powerful reset button, and it had the aesthetic of a particularly boring dentist office. She approached the console slowly, half expecting alarms or security systems or literally anything that acknowledged the gravity of what stood before her. Nothing. The displays flickered to life automatically, recognizing her credentials, welcoming her with text that scrolled across multiple languages, until settling on English. Welcome, Director. God key terminal accessed. Please input authorization code to proceed with system calibration. Her hands trembled over the haptic interface. 6 days until her planet died. 6 days until 8 billion people became a footnote in Galactic Preservation Authority reports. Another case study in species that couldn't follow the rules. 6 days until Earth got factory reset by bureaucrats who'd filed the paperwork in triplicate. She had access to the one thing that could change everything, and absolutely no idea what she was doing. The God key terminal hummed with the kind of patient energy that suggested it had all the time in the universe, which was ironic considering its primary function involved erasing timelines. The holographic interface floated before her, waiting for input with the bland persistence of customer service automation. Somewhere in the station's infrastructure, quantum processors older than human civilization were spinning up, preparing to facilitate planetary murder with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt the peculiar calm that came from realizing the situation had escalated so far beyond reasonable, that normal emotional responses had simply given up and gone home. The authorization code blinked expectantly. She had it memorized from the files she'd accessed, a string of characters that had been updated exactly once in the past 4,000 years, when someone decided the previous code restore planet. The new code was barely better, but at least it required capital letters and a special character. Galactic Security Theater at its finest. Before she could talk herself out of it, her fingers moved across the haptic interface. The terminal accepted the code with a pleasant chime that sounded disturbingly similar to a microwave finishing popcorn. Authentication confirmed. Systems calibrating. Estimated time to full operational status: 43 hours. Well, she was committed now. The smart move would have been leaving immediately, returning to her quarters, and pretending this moment of insanity had never happened. Instead, she settled into the operator's chair, designed for beings with vastly different spinal structures, but surprisingly comfortable, and started reading. If she was going to commit cosmic treason, she might as well understand the weapon she was wielding. The God key documentation was exhaustive, written with the kind of obsessive detail that suggested the original authors had assumed future operators would be significantly less intelligent than the technology itself. Probably a fair assumption, given that anyone smart enough to properly understand the system would presumably be smart enough not to use it. The interface walked through every conceivable scenario, with the patience of a teacher explaining fractions to particularly slow students. Planetary restoration, the files cheerfully explained, was not destruction. Destruction was crude, inefficient, wasteful. The God key didn't destroy worlds, it optimized. Every molecule, every atom, every quantum fluctuation got analyzed, cataloged, and then reorganized into the planet's theoretical ideal state. What that ideal state looked like depended entirely on the parameters entered by the operator. Standard GPA protocols used pre-approved restoration models that returned planets to primordial conditions, suitable for new development. Clean slates. Fresh starts. Planets scrubbed of inconvenient civilizations, and returned to the galactic real estate market with excellent school districts and no prior owner complication. But the system had other options. Hidden deep in submenus that required additional authorization. Her accidentally omnipotent credentials provided were alternative restoration modes, custom parameters, operator-directed optimism, the ability to define what the planet should become rather than accepting the factory default. She sat back, mind churning through implications. The GPA wanted Earth restored to standard specification, breathable atmosphere, stable tectonics, moderate climate zones. No pesky humans mucking about with nuclear weapons and plastic straws. A nice, clean, marketable product, ready for species that knew how to follow the rules. Her credentials said she could change. The question was what to change it to, and whether she had any right to make that decision for 8 billion people who had no idea she existed or that their continued existence was currently in the hands of a 23-year-old who'd gotten spectacularly lost on her way home from a bar. A proximity alert chimed softly. Someone approaching the corridor. She killed the display with a gesture, affecting the posture of someone who absolutely belonged in the apocalypse chamber at midnight station time. The door chimed. She didn't breathe. A Benthosian security officer oozed through the entrance, its translucent form rippling with bioluminescent patterns that suggested mild curiosity rather than alarm. The translation node on its harness crackled to life. Director, unexpected presence noted. Systems show terminal activation. Standard procedure requires advanced scheduling for calibration access. She channeled every ounce of confidence she'd accumulated through 8 months of faking competence in a job she didn't understand, performing preliminary assessment. Earth restoration scheduled for 6 rotations. Want to ensure systems are optimal. You understand. The Benthosian pulsed thoughtfully, patterns shifting through its gelatinous mass. Security officers, regardless of species, shared a universal trait. They really didn't want to fill out incident reports, especially not reports questioning the actions of a director-level administrator
who was technically following procedures, just with questionable timing. Understood. Director, recommend logging session for administrative records. Regulations Section 47 subsection 93. Naturally. Appreciate the diligence. The security officer bobbed in what might have been a nod or might have been normal Benthosian movement, then oozed back through the door. The lock chimed behind it. She released a breath she'd been holding long enough to make her vision spot. 8 months. She'd been accidentally employed for 8 months, and only now was someone almost questioning her presence. The sheer bureaucratic inertia that allowed this situation to exist was almost impressive, almost enough to make her understand how civilizations could fail 47 compliance checks while sincerely believing they were handling things fine. She pulled the interface back up, hands steadier now. The security encounter had crystallized something. She wasn't going to walk away. Couldn't walk away. Not when she had access to the only lever in the universe that might save her species from filing errors and cosmic homeowners association violations. But she needed to understand what she was dealing with. Really understand.
The God Key's history files painted an interesting picture. 7 previous activations across galactic history, each one documented with clinical precision. The Vorthian Empire collapsed under economic mismanagement and civil war. Their 3 core worlds restored to primordial states, and resettled by colonies that promised better fiscal responsibility. The crystalline reaches, a failed experiment in group consciousness that had accidentally merged 14 billion individuals into one screaming gestalt entity, their planet mercifully reset with significantly more individual boundaries. The burning worlds of Sector 90, where a species had discovered fusion power, and immediately decided that nuclear warfare was the best solution to minor theological disagreements. Each restoration had followed the same pattern: evaluation, deliberation, authorization, activation. Each time, the reset had been deemed necessary, unavoidable, the only reasonable response to civilizations that couldn't maintain basic standards. Each time, the beings making those decisions had been comfortable, distant, untouched by the consequences of their choices. None of them had been from the planet getting erased. She pulled up Earth's assessment files, reading through the litany of failures that had condemned her world. The carbon levels weren't lies. Humanity was absolutely speed-running climate catastrophe with impressive dedication. The nuclear incidents were real, documented with timestamps and satellite imagery. The AI development concerns were valid, even if they came from species that had somehow managed to develop interstellar travel before inventing paperclip. But buried in the files between official assessments and compliance reports were smaller notes, observations from field agents stationed on Earth, comments about human art, music, literature, mentions of how quickly humanity had progressed from stone tools to space stations, a developmental curve that outpaced most galactic species by significant margin. Notes about human cooperation during disasters, the bizarre tendency for the species to occasionally overcome their terrible decision-making with acts of staggering compassion and creativity. One agent, a Yenith anthropologist, had written a fascinating humans, the report argued, weren't failing to meet standards. They were developing faster than their wisdom could keep pace with their intelligence, a growing pain that most species experienced over millennia. But humanity was compressing into centuries. Give them time, give them guidance, give them literally anything other than annihilation, and they might surprise everyone. The report had been filed under minority opinion not actionable, and ignored. She closed the files, leaning back in the chair that wasn't designed for human spines but was managing admirably. 43 hours until the God Key reached full operational capacity. 6 days until scheduled activation. Somewhere between now and then she needed to decide if she was really going to do this. The terminal pulsed softly, displays cycling through readiness checks and system diagnostic. Ancient technology preparing to do what it had done 7 times before, indifferent to the lives it would reorganize, unconcerned with questions of justice, or mercy, or whether the beings making these decisions had any right to play deity. She thought about home, not the abstract concept of Earth, or the political entities that represented humanity to the Galactic Union, but home, the small apartment she'd left behind, the job she'd hated but needed,
The family she called every week until communications got too expensive from deep space. The friends who'd celebrated her birthday before she'd drunkenly boarded the wrong transport and fallen sideways into cosmic significance. 8 billion people living their lives, unaware that their continued existence depended on paperwork and compliance checks and the whims of beings who measured catastrophe in forms filed triplicate. The God key hummed patiently, waiting for instructions, ready to serve whatever purpose its operator defined. She had 43 hours to figure out what that purpose should be, and she was absolutely going to need more coffee first.
The coffee came from a dispensary, 3 levels up, that catered to carbon-based life forms with stimulant dependencies. It tasted like burnt regret, filtered through institutional apathy, which felt appropriate given the circumstances. She'd spent the past 37 hours alternating between the God key terminal and her assigned quarters, reading documentation until her eyes burned and her brain felt like it was leaking out her ears. The system was simultaneously more complex and more horrifyingly simple than she'd imagined. Complex because the underlying technology involved quantum manipulation on scales that made particle physics look like kindergarten edition. The God key didn't just rearrange matter, it reached into the fundamental probability states of reality and convinced atoms that they'd really rather be somewhere else, doing something else, existing in configurations that served new purposes. Planetary restoration worked by convincing an entire world that its current state was actually just a bad dream, and wouldn't it prefer to wake up as something better? Simple because the operator interface had been designed for idiots. Big buttons, clear labels, drop-down menus with helpful tooltips. The galaxy's most powerful reality editing weapon had a user experience designed by someone who understood that the beings operating it would likely be stressed, possibly terrified, and definitely in no condition to pass complex commands. The entire system could be activated with roughly the same cognitive effort required to order food delivery. She'd found the custom parameter settings buried in a submenu labeled Advanced Options, Authorized Personnel Only. Her credentials had opened it without complaint, revealing an interface that looked less like a weapon of mass destruction and more like a character creation screen from a particularly ambitious video game. Planetary optimization parameters, the header read cheerfully, define desired outcome state. System will calculate optimal transformation pathway. Below that, fields for environmental conditions, geological stability, atmospheric composition, biological complexity, sliders and input boxes that let operators fine-tune exactly what kind of world they wanted to create. And at the bottom, in smaller text that suggested the designers knew this feature was either brilliant or catastrophically dangerous, operator intent integration allows system to interpret operator's subconscious preferences for optimal outcome. She'd read that line 17 times. Each time finding new implications to be terrified about. The God key could read mind, not actively, not invasively, but during the optimization process it analyzed the operator's neural patterns, their unconscious desires, their fundamental understanding of what a planet should be. Standard templates ignored this feature using pre-approved parameters that eliminated operator bias. Custom restorations embraced it, letting the system paint with broader strokes based on what the operator truly wanted, even if they couldn't articulate it consciously, which meant that whatever she entered into this system would be filtered through her own understanding of Earth, humanity, and what a restored planet should look like. No pressure. A tutorial hologram had materialized sometime during hour 22 of her research, apparently triggered by excessive time spent on the advanced options screen without committing to any choices. It took the form of a generically pleasant humanoid figure, gender neutral and species ambiguous, with the kind of manufactured warmth that suggested extensive customer service training. Greetings, operator. You appear to be experiencing decision paralysis regarding custom restoration parameters. Would you like assistance? She'd nearly fallen out of the chair. You're disturbingly cheerful for an apocalypse assistant. I am programmed to maintain operator calm during high-stress procedures. Planetary restoration is a significant responsibility. Anxiety is counterproductive. Would you like to discuss your concerns? My concerns are that I'm about to make decisions affecting 8 billion lives using a system I barely understand while committing multiple counts of cosmic treason. Valid concern.
However, analysis suggests you have sufficient authorization and comprehension for successful operation. Your credentials indicate director-level access. Your research patterns demonstrate thorough engagement with operational parameters. Psychological assessment rates your decision-making capacity as adequate. That's reassuring. I am not programmed for reassurance beyond operational parameters. I am programmed for successful planetary restoration. Do you wish to proceed with custom optimization? She'd argued with the hologram for 3 hours. It had the infinite patience of software and the conversational flexibility of a brick wall, but it had answered her questions, walking through scenarios and outcomes with clinical precision. What happened if she input minimal changes? The system would apply them, leaving most of Earth's current state intact while correcting specified parameters. What happened if she left fields blank? The system would extrapolate based on operator intent, filling gaps with what it calculated she actually wanted. What happened if she completely botched the input? The system had safeguards preventing physically impossible outcomes, but within the bounds of reality it would attempt whatever she specified. The hologram had been particularly insistent about one point: custom restorations were permanent. No undo function, no rollback option. Once the God key activated, the planet would transform according to her parameters, and that would be its new reality, forever. Now, with 6 hours remaining before the GPA's scheduled activation window, she sat before the terminal with input fields glowing expectantly. The station's night cycle had emptied the corridors. Her stolen credentials had bought her uninterrupted access. The God key hummed with readiness. Quantum processors spun up and waiting for purpose. She could enter the standard template, return Earth to primordial conditions, eliminating humanity but preserving the planet for future use, save 8 billion lives by erasing them completely, leaving behind a world that might one day support new civilizations that followed the rules better. She could attempt minimal intervention, tweak atmospheric carbon levels, stabilize climate systems, maybe introduce some planetary defense mechanisms against future catastrophes, leave humanity intact but give them a chance to correct course without the GPA's scheduled annihilation. Or she could do something monumentally stupid. Her fingers moved across the haptic interface, entering parameters with the confidence of someone who'd completely lost perspective on reasonable behavior. Environmental systems, self-correcting within acceptable ranges for human habitability. Geological stability, enhanced, sufficient to withstand human industrial activity. Atmospheric composition, optimized for current biological requirements with adaptive regulatory mechanisms. Then she reached the field labeled defensive parameters, optional. The documentation had been clear. Planets could be given autonomy, not consciousness, exactly, but responsive systems that reacted to threats. Most restored worlds received basic protections against cosmic hazards, asteroid deflection, radiation shielding, that sort of thing. Custom restorations could specify additional parameters. She thought about the Benthosian bureaucrats discussing Earth's destruction over lunch, the Farit administrators strobing with amusement about compliance failure, the casual indifference of beings who'd never face consequences for the civilizations they erased. Her fingers kept moving, entering specifications that probably violated several dozen galactic regulations she'd never bothered reading. Adaptive response to external administrative threats, automated bureaucratic resistance protocols, planetary scale objection filing systems. The hologram materialized again, flickering with what might have been concern. Warning: specified parameters include non-standard defensive configurations. Confirm intentional input. Confirm. Parameters suggest planet will actively resist future GPA intervention. This constitutes violation of authority regulations. Proceed anyway. She thought about 8 billion people who deserved better than death by paperwork. Proceed. Acknowledged. Operator intent integration. Act. System calculating optimal transformation pathway. Estimated completion, 14 seconds. The terminal pulsed. Displays shifting through calculations faster than human perception could follow. Somewhere in the quantum depths, the God key was interpreting her conscious commands and unconscious desires, painting a picture of what Earth should become. The display stabilized. Optimization pathway calculated. Parameters accepted. Ready for activation. Warning: activation is irreversible. Confirm final authorization. Her hand hovered over the haptic interface. This was it. The moment where she either saved her world or destroyed it in ways she couldn't predict. The God Key waited patiently, indifferent to her crisis, ready to reshape reality according to her specifications, and whatever her subconscious had contributed to the mix. She entered the activation command. The terminal chimed cheerfully, and 8 billion lives became her responsibility. The observation lounge had been designed for beings who appreciated irony. Floor-to-ceiling viewports displayed Earth in perfect resolution, a blue marble floating in the void, blissfully unaware that it was currently experiencing an existential software update. She'd acquired something purple from the dispensary that the translation matrix claimed was approximately equivalent to vodka. It tasted like regret mixed with antiseptic, which felt thematically appropriate. 3 hours into the transformation, the first alerts started arriving. Not alarm, nothing so dramatic as alarms, just polite notifications appearing on her personal interface, the kind of routine updates that station personnel receive dozens of times per shift. Except, these weren't routine. These were confused Benthosian scientists, reporting atmospheric anomalies that their models couldn't explain. Farit observers, noting geological stabilization patterns that preceded their monitoring system. Yenith bureaucrats discovering that their scheduled compliance reports were being automatically rejected by systems that shouldn't exist. Earth was waking up, and it had opinion. She watched through the viewport as the transformation completed its final stages, invisible forces finishing their work. From this distance the planet looked unchanged. Same continents, same oceans, same swirling cloud patterns that humanity had stared at since the first satellites achieved orbit. But underneath that familiar surface, everything had shifted. The world had been optimized, enhanced, given tools to resist the casual annihilation that the GPA had scheduled with such bureaucratic cheerfulness. Her interface chimed again. This time, not a routine notification, a priority summons. Report to administrative level immediately. Presence of director required for emergency assessment. The vodka equivalent burned down her throat. She'd known this moment was coming. Surprising it had taken this long. The administrative level looked exactly like every other level, except the beings here moved with purpose instead of the usual institutional lethargy. She was ushered into a conference chamber where harmonious dissolution stood strobing with patterns that the translation matrix struggled to interpret. Confusion, primarily, with undertones of something that might have been respect or might have been homicidal rage. Translation matrices were imprecise with Farit emotional content. Director, your presence is timely. We have encountered unprecedented complications with the Earth restoration. She affected confusion with the skill of 8 months' practice. Complication. The God Key reports successful completion. Successful completion of parameters that were not approved. A Benthosian administrator oozed forward, bioluminescence pulsing with agitation. The planet is rejecting our assessment protocol. Every attempt to file post-restoration documentation encounters systematic resistance. Our compliance forms are being returned with counter-documentation that we did not request and cannot process. Furthermore, harmonious dissolution strobed. Preliminary analysis suggests the restoration included defensive specifications far exceeding standard parameters. Earth appears to have developed autonomous bureaucratic resistance capabilities. This was not in the approved template. She let silence stretch, taking the measure of the room. Confusion, yes. Anger, certainly. But underneath, something else. The GPA officials were looking at her not with accusation but with baffled fascination. They thought this was intentional. They believed she'd engineered a solution they couldn't comprehend. Earth failed 47 compliance checks, she said carefully, because humanity operates on different timescales than galactic administration. They develop faster than regulatory frameworks anticipate. Standard restoration would have eliminated that developmental advantage. Custom parameters preserved it while addressing core stability concerns. By making the planet administratively hostile to our authority, the Benthosian rippled with what might have been indignation. By making the planet resistant to premature intervention, Earth will still comply with fundamental galactic stability requirements. It simply won't tolerate being erased for paperwork violations. Consider it aggressive self-advocacy. Harmonious dissolution strobed through a pattern that the translation matrix labeled as contemplative amusement. You have created a world that argues back, that generates its own compliance documentation, that treats bureaucratic extinction as a problem to be solved rather than accept. I created a world that survives contact with the GPA. The silence that followed was broken by an alert appearing on the central display. Another automated rejection from Earth, this one responding to a routine monitoring query with 17 pages of counter documentation, explaining why the query violated the planet's newly established autonomous defense protocols. The paperwork was flawless, properly formatted, citing galactic regulations with precision that suggested Earth had developed a sophisticated understanding of the system trying to control it. A Yenith administrator made a sound that translated as delighted horror. It's learned. The planet is learning our regulatory framework and using it as a weapon. Not a weapon, she corrected. A shield. Earth will cooperate with legitimate galactic governance. It will simply refuse to be casually destroyed by bureaucratic oversight. Harmonious dissolutions strobing shifted into patterns the translation matrix struggled to interpret. Finally, it settled on something approximating resigned admiration. Director, your approach to planetary restoration is unorthodox but effective. Earth cannot be scheduled for future intervention using standard protocols. The administrative burden alone would occupy our resources for centuries.